The mop bucket squeaked against the marble floor at 11:47 p.m., and that single small sound stopped me cold in the doorway of my own company's 42nd floor lobby. I had come back for a folder I'd forgotten. Nothing more, planning to grab it and leave before the cleaning crew even noticed the CEO was still in the building. But then I saw her wrist. A thin, pale wrist with a small star-shaped birthmark just below the base of her thumb. Exactly where my daughter's had been the day she vanished from my life 12 years ago. I did not move. I did not breathe. The folder in my hand slid to the floor, and I didn't even hear it land. My name is Weston Cole. I'm 47 years old, and I built Kestrel Dynamics from a garage in Evanston into a company that now occupies 11 floors of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, employing over 6,000 people across 4 countries. To the business press, I'm the man on magazine covers, the boy genius turned billionaire, the guy who supposedly has everything figured out. To my accountants, I'm a signature on quarterly reports. But to almost nobody in that building did I exist as what I actually am underneath the suits in the keynote speeches. A father who lost his little girl in a custody dispute that turned into a nightmare, and who never once, in 12 years, stopped looking for her. Before I tell you what happened in that lobby and everything that came after, I need you to subscribe to this channel and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and stories like this one deserve to be remembered, not scrolled past. Now let me take you back to where this all began, because you need to understand exactly what I lost before you understand what I found. I married Priscilla Bishop when I was 29 years old, back when Kestrel Dynamics was still 4 employees crammed into a rented office above a dry cleaner's. She had a laugh that filled up empty rooms, and when our daughter Nora was born 2 years later, I remember standing in the hospital hallway, crying harder than I ever had in my life, holding a cup of vending machine coffee I never drank, just staring through the glass at this tiny person who somehow already had my mother's nose. Nora was 5 years old when the marriage started cracking, and 6 when it shattered completely. The divorce wasn't quiet. Priscilla accused me of neglect because I worked 80-hour weeks trying to keep the company alive during a funding crisis that nearly buried us. I accused her of drinking too much and disappearing for days without calling. The judge granted joint custody with alternating weeks, and for 8 months that arrangement actually worked. Badly, but it worked. Then one Friday afternoon, Priscilla was supposed to drop Nora off at my apartment at 6 p.m. 6 o'clock came and went. 7 o'clock. Midnight. I called every number I had. I drove to her building, and the landlord told me she'd moved out 3 days earlier, paid the final month in cash, left no forwarding address. I filed a missing persons report that same night. The detective assigned to the case, a tired man named Rourke, with a mustache stained yellow from decades of coffee, told me something I've never forgotten. He said, "Mr. Cole, when a parent takes a child during a custody dispute, sometimes the system treats it like a family matter instead of a kidnapping, even when it absolutely is one." Because Priscilla technically still had legal custody rights that week, the case moved at a crawl that made me want to put my fist through a wall. I hired private investigators. I hired more private investigators when the first ones came back empty-handed. I spent more money chasing rumors and dead-end tips across 6 states than most companies spend on entire marketing budgets, and every single lead evaporated like smoke the moment I got close enough to touch it. For the first 2 years, I barely functioned. I'd sit in board meetings and suddenly realize I hadn't heard a single word anyone said because I was picturing Nora's face, wondering if she was cold, wondering if she remembered the lullaby I used to hum, wondering if she still slept with a stuffed rabbit with the chewed ear that she named Mr. Buttons, after a cartoon character neither of us could remember the actual name of. My executive team quietly absorbed my responsibilities without ever saying why, because everyone knew, and everyone was terrified to bring it up directly. I built Kestrel Dynamics into an empire during those years, not because I wanted wealth, but because working 18-hour days was the only thing that kept my mind from tearing itself apart at 3 in the morning. I never remarried. I dated exactly twice in 12 years, both times ending the same way, with me staring at some kind, patient woman across a dinner table while my mind was 3 states away, searching a face in a crowd that never turned out to be hers. Every single year, on Nora's birthday, I bought a cake. I know how that sounds. I bought a small cake, lit 6 candles, then 7, then 8, all the way up through this year's 17. And I sat alone in my kitchen, and I blew them out myself because some part of me refused to let the tradition die just because she wasn't there to see it. So when I stood in that lobby doorway at 6:40 in the morning, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, half listening to a voicemail from my CFO about a board call I didn't want to take, I nearly walked right past her without looking twice. Then the mop bucket squeaked against the marble, and she turned her head to check the wheels, and something in the angle of her jaw stopped my whole body cold. My shoes stuck to that floor like the marble had turned to wet cement. My assistant, Priya, was 2 steps ahead of me, still talking about quarterly numbers, and she had to stop and come back because I wasn't answering her anymore. I wasn't hearing anything. I was staring at a 17-year-old girl in a gray uniform vest pushing a yellow cleaning cart across the lobby of the building with my name carved into the granite above the door, and every hair on my arms stood straight up. It was the ear. That's what did it. She had this tiny mark behind her left ear, shaped almost like a comma, a birthmark her mother used to kiss every night before bed and call her lucky punctuation. I hadn't seen that mark in 11 years, but I had spent 11 years trying not to forget it, along with the exact shade of brown in her eyes and the gap in her front teeth she used to stick her tongue through when she laughed too hard. She had her hair pulled back that morning, tucked under a company-issued cap, and the cap had ridden up just enough on one side to show that mark clean and clear under the lobby lights, and my legs simply stopped working. Priya touched my elbow and asked if I was all right, and I heard myself say something about a headache, and my voice came out flat and strange, like it belonged to someone standing behind me instead of inside me. I did not walk toward the girl. I did not say a word to her. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to cross that lobby floor and grab her by the shoulders and demand to know her name. But 11 years of therapy and disappointment had taught me one thing above all else, which was that hope moves faster than facts, and hope has ruined me before. I had chased 3 other girls in 3 other cities over the years. A waitress in Denver with the same color hair, a college student in Austin who laughed exactly like Nora used to laugh, high and sudden, like it surprised her every time. A hospital intern in Seattle who had the same walk, the same way of leading with her left shoulder. Every single time I had convinced myself I'd finally found her. And every single time I had been wrong. And every single time the wrongness had cracked something inside my chest a little further, until I promised myself I would never again let my body get ahead of proof. So instead of crossing the floor and doing something I could not undo, I stood very still at the railing of the mezzanine, gripped the cold brass handrail until my knuckles went pale, and made myself breathe like a man who had survived enough false alarms to know better than to trust his own eyes. My assistant, Priya, was 3 steps behind me, phone already in her hand, sensing before I said a single word that something in my posture had changed. She had worked for me for 6 years. She knew the difference between the version of me that walked into board meetings like a closed door and the version of me that occasionally, rarely, cracked open just enough for something human to slip through. She saw the crack now. "Sir," she said quietly, careful not to raise her voice, careful not to draw the eyes of the 2 security guards stationed near the elevator bank below. I didn't answer right away. Down on the atrium floor, the girl in the gray janitorial uniform had moved on from the window and was now kneeling beside a potted fig tree near the reception desk, carefully wiping dust from each individual leaf with a microfiber cloth. The kind of unnecessary attentiveness that told me either she took genuine pride in a job most people did with their eyes half closed, or she was the kind of person who needed her hands busy, so her mind wouldn't wander somewhere darker. My daughter used to do that. Every leaf, every windowsill, every baseboard, as if the world could be made bearable, one clean surface at a time. "Priya," I said finally, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. "I need you to pull the employee records for the janitorial contractor, whoever's running crews in this building tonight." She blinked, glanced down at the girl, then back up at me, and I watched her calculate the distance between the question I'd asked and the question underneath it. "The cleaning company? Brightline Facilities Group?" "Yes, tonight's roster. Every name assigned to the West Tower, floors 1 through 40. "Is there a problem with the contract?" she asked, already opening the HR portal on her tablet, already halfway into professional mode, because that was how she survived working for me. She compartmentalized my occasional strangeness into categories she could manage. "No problem with the contract," I said. "I want to see a face." She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her expression told me she understood more than I'd said, though she couldn't possibly have known the whole of it. She had heard fragments over the years. A stray comment during a late-night flight back from Singapore. A moment 3 Christmases ago when I'd stared too long at a photograph on my desk, and she'd quietly closed my office door so no one would see. She knew there was a hole in me shaped like a person, even if she didn't know the exact dimensions of it. "Give me 2 minutes," she said, and disappeared toward the service elevator, heels clicking fast against the marble. I stayed at the railing. I told myself not to look down again, and then I looked down again, because some instructions the body simply refuses to obey. The girl had finished with the fig tree, and was standing now, stretching her lower back, the way people do after too many hours on their knees, one hand pressed flat against her spine, and in that single, unconscious gesture, I saw something that made my chest tighten, in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. It wasn't proof. I knew that. A stretch was not a fingerprint. 1,000 women stretched their backs the same way after cleaning floors. But my body did not care about statistics in that moment. My body remembered a smaller version of that exact motion, a 7-year-old girl leaning against a kitchen counter after helping me scrub burnt macaroni off a pan, hand pressed to her back like she'd seen adults do it and thought it looked appropriately tired and important. I forced myself to look away this time, out toward the skyline instead, at the amber haze of the city, settling into evening, because if I kept staring, I was going to do something reckless. And reckless was exactly what had gotten my hopes broken in Denver and Phoenix and Seattle and half a dozen other cities I'd flown to, on nothing but a rumor and a resemblance. Priya returned faster than 2 minutes, which told me she had run instead of walked. She held the tablet toward me, and I noticed her hand wasn't quite steady either, as if my urgency had become slightly contagious. "Brightline rotates their crews weekly," she said. "Tonight's team for this building is 4 people. Here." She pulled up the roster. 4 names, 4 small ID photos, the kind of low-resolution employee badge pictures that make everyone look faintly guilty of something. I scanned past the first name, a heavy-set man in his 50s, named Dale Whitcomb. Past the second, a young man, barely 20, named Kevin Ruiz. My eyes landed on the third, Nora Bennett, age 23. Photos showed a young woman with her hair pulled back tight, no makeup, expression carefully blank in the way people arrange their faces for documents they don't want to think too hard about. The lighting in the photo was bad, washing her out, flattening her features. It could have been anyone. It could have been no one. And yet, I stared at that photograph the way I imagine drowning men stare at a shoreline. They're not sure is real. Greedy, disbelieving, terrified of the moment the mirage dissolves. The shape of the jaw was close. The set of the eyes was close. There was a small dark mark just below her left ear, barely visible in the grainy photo. The kind of thing you'd only notice if you already knew to look for it. Which I did, because I had spent 17 years memorizing every mark on my daughter's body, from the day the nurse first laid her on my chest, in a hospital I could still describe, floor tile by floor tile. "Sir," Priya's voice, gentle. "Do you recognize her?" "I don't know," I said, which was the most honest sentence I'd spoken all day. "Pull up the birthmark policy photo. Whatever they have on file for identification purposes. Insurance forms, background check documentation, anything with more detail than a badge photo." Priya's fingers moved fast across the tablet. Brightline, like most contractors handling access to corporate buildings, ran basic background checks and kept copies of government ID scans on file for compliance purposes. It took her another 90 seconds during which I did not breathe properly, and then she turned the tablet toward me again. A scanned driver's license. Same young woman, better resolution this time, front-facing, no room to hide anything. And there, just below her jaw on the left side, a small irregular birthmark shaped almost like a comma, dark brown against pale skin. I had seen that exact mark 1,000 times. I had watched a pediatrician point to it during a well child visit when my daughter was 4, and reassure me it was nothing to worry about, just a cluster of pigmented cells, cosmetically insignificant, medically irrelevant. I had watched her mother trace it absently with one finger, while our daughter slept against her shoulder, on nights when the baby wouldn't settle. I had watched it disappear under a winter scarf every year, and reappear every spring like something returning from hibernation. It was in the exact same place, the exact same shape. My hand actually shook when I reached for the tablet, and Priya, to her credit, didn't say anything about it. She just let me hold the device and stare at the license as though staring long enough might make it confess something. The name on the license read, Nora Ellen Bennett. That wasn't right. That wasn't her name. My daughter's name was Emily Grace Whitfield, named for her mother's grandmother and for the small stubborn hope I'd carried into the delivery room, that a name like Grace might somehow protect a child from a world that hadn't been especially graceful to me. Nora Bennett was not Emily Whitfield. Nora Bennett was a stranger's name, clean and unremarkable, the kind of name a person chooses specifically because it draws no attention, files no red flags, triggers no searches. But then my eyes moved down to the date of birth field, printed in small block letters beneath her photograph, and the air went out of the mezzanine. March 14th. The exact date. Not a close date, not a plausible coincidence within a season, but the precise day, the precise month, the precise year that would put her at 23 years old this spring, which was exactly, to the month, how old my daughter would be. I had to set the tablet down on the railing because my hands weren't cooperating anymore. "Sir," Priya said, and there was real concern in her voice now, the professional distance cracking. "Marcus, what's happening?" I hadn't heard her use my first name in over a year. She reserved it for emergencies, the night my mother had the stroke, the morning the merger with Callaway Systems nearly collapsed, and I'd needed someone to talk me down from making a call I would have regretted. Hearing it now told me she understood, even without the full context, that whatever was unfolding in front of me had breached some boundary I usually kept sealed. "That birth date," I said, forcing the words out slowly, deliberately, because I needed to hear myself say them to believe them. "That is my daughter's birth date. Not close. Exact." Priya's mouth opened slightly. She had never heard me use that phrase before. My daughter. Not once in 6 years of working 18-hour days beside me. Not once during the long silences on private jets when I stared out the window instead of reviewing quarterly reports. Not once during the 2 occasions she'd found me at my desk at 3 a.m. with a bottle I hadn't opened, but had been staring at like it might answer a question for me. She had guessed at the shape of my grief. She had never been handed its name. "You have a daughter," she said. Not quite a question, more like she was testing whether the sentence could hold weight. "I had a daughter," I said. "She disappeared when she was 6. Her mother took her and vanished, and I have spent 17 years and more money than I'm willing to admit trying to find either of them. And every lead has been wrong, every single one. And I promised myself after the last one that I would stop letting hope make decisions for me." Priya looked down at the atrium floor, at the young woman now coiling an extension cord near a floor buffer, oblivious to the fact that 2 people 40 feet above her were dissecting the entire architecture of her existence. "But the birthmark," Priya said, "and the birth date. That's not nothing, sir." That's not the same as a walk that looked familiar or an intern in Seattle. I know, I said. That's exactly why I'm terrified. Because a walk could be explained away. A resemblance could be argued down by exhaustion and wishful thinking. But a birthmark in the precise same location, in the precise same shape, paired with a birth date that matched not within a range, but to the day. That combination did not exist on the long list of coincidences I'd forced myself to catalog and dismiss over the years. That combination sat in a different category entirely, one I hadn't let myself visit in a long time, because visiting it meant admitting that if this too turned out to be nothing, I might not survive the disappointment intact. I looked down again. Nora Bennett. If that was even a name she'd chosen for herself, and not one given to her by circumstance, by whoever had raised her, by whatever version of her life had happened in the 17 years since I'd last held her hand crossing a parking lot in Ohio, was crouched now, gathering scattered paper clips someone had spilled near the reception desk, dropping them one by one into a small dustpan with a patience that seemed almost meditative. She moved like someone who had learned to make herself small in rooms that didn't belong to her. She moved like someone used to being invisible. The kind of invisible you learn on purpose, the kind you practice in front of a mirror until nobody's eyes catch on you longer than half a second. I know that particular invisibility because I built an entire company, hiding a different kind of scar. And I recognized the architecture of it in the way she kept her chin tilted down, even when the dustpan was full, and there was nothing left on the marble to justify looking at the floor. My assistant, Priya, came back up the service stairwell instead of the main elevator, which told me she understood, without me saying it, that this wasn't something to broadcast to the 40th floor. She had a manila folder pressed flat against her ribs, like she was smuggling something out of a building that was, in fact, mine. The contract's through English Sun's facilities group, she said quietly, keeping her back to the glass railing so no one below could read her lips. Third-party janitorial staffing. We don't employ her directly. She's been on our floors for 4 months, always the 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. shift, always the West Wing. 4 months, I repeated, and the number sat wrong in my chest, because it meant she had been within 300 feet of my office. Some nights, probably close enough that the air she breathed had cycled through the same vents mine had, and I hadn't known. 4 months of walking past a ghost I'd spent 17 years failing to find, with 3 different investigative firms, and more money than any single search should have required. The name on file is Callie Reyes, Priya said. Birth date March 3rd, 2007. I didn't say anything. I couldn't for a second, because March 3rd, 2007 wasn't a date I had to check against anything. It was carved into me the way certain dates get carved into men who spend the rest of their lives measuring time by them. That was Elena's birthday, my daughter's birthday, down to the day. Social Security number traces to a Callie Reyes born in Toledo, Priya continued, reading off her tablet now, voice low and even, the voice of someone who had learned a long time ago not to react visibly to whatever I handed her. Except the Toledo records show a Callie Reyes who died in infancy in 2007. Crib death, according to the county record. Whoever built this identity used a real dead child's Social Security number, which means somebody did this carefully. Somebody who knew what they were doing. I gripped the mezzanine railing until my knuckles went the color of the marble beneath her hands, 2 floors down. Or somebody taught her to do it, I said, because that was the part that turned my stomach. Not that my daughter might be scrubbing floors in the building that bore my name, but that someone had handed a child a dead girl's identity and taught her to wear it the way other parents teach their kids to ride a bike, patiently, repeatedly, until it became instinct. That kind of skill isn't something a teenager invents alone in a bus station bathroom. That kind of skill is inherited from someone who needed her hidden badly enough to plan for it. Do you want me to pull the background check English Sons ran when they hired her? Priya asked. Do it quietly. Don't let anyone at English Sons know we're looking. If she finds out we've been digging into her before I've said a single word to her, she'll disappear again, and this time she'll know to disappear from a man with resources, which means she'll disappear better. Priya nodded and started to turn, then stopped. Marcus, she said, and she almost never used my first name. Not in 7 years of working 16-hour days together, not through 2 hostile takeovers and 1 congressional hearing that nearly ended the company. Are you sure? The photo in the file, the birthmark you asked me to check. It's her, I said. It's on the inside of her left wrist, shaped like a comma. Her mother used to say it looked like the universe was still writing her sentence. I don't need a DNA test to tell me that. I've had 17 years of dreams to memorize that mark. Priya didn't argue after that. She'd worked for me long enough to know when a decision had already calcified past the point where facts could soften it, and long enough to know better than to point out that dreams aren't admissible in the kind of proof a rational man should require before upending a stranger's entire fabricated life. But I hadn't built Callaway Dynamics by waiting for perfect proof. I'd built it by trusting the one instinct that had never lied to me, and that instinct was screaming. Below us, Callie, I made myself think the name, even though every cell in my body wanted to think Elena. Finished with the paper clips, straightened, and pressed a hand briefly to the small of her back, the way people do when they've been on their feet since before the sun went down, and won't be off them again until well after it rises. She couldn't have been more than 110 pounds, soaking wet, and she moved the industrial floor buffer like it weighed more than she did, which it probably did. I watched her push it in slow, even passes across the lobby floor. The machines hum, rising and falling with the changing angle. And I thought about every single Christmas morning. I'd sat alone in a house too big for one man, staring at a stocking I never took down because taking it down felt like giving up, and how none of those mornings had prepared me for the specific physical pain of watching my daughter work a night shift 12 feet below the office, where I made more money in an hour than she probably made in a week. I want a name for the site supervisor, I told Priya. Tonight, not tomorrow. There's a woman who signs off on the West Wing shift logs, Dolores Ferreira. She's been with English Sons 11 years, has a reputation for running a tight, fair crew. I can have contact information in 20 minutes. Get it. And Priya, nobody touches Callie's file. Nobody so much as looks at it sideways. If English Sons gets nervous and reassigns her before I get a chance to approach this the right way, I will personally buy that contracting company and fire everyone in it, down to the coffee cart guy. Priya, to her credit, didn't smile at the threat, though I caught the corner of her mouth twitch before she disappeared back down the service stairwell, tablet already glowing with the next task. I stayed at the railing a while longer, alone, because I needed the time to figure out how a man says the first sentence to a daughter he lost when she was 8 years old and finds again when she's 22. If the math I was doing in my head was even close to right, she'd be 22 now, or closing in on it, depending on the month. And the woman below me looked every part of 22 and exhausted in ways 22 shouldn't have to be. I thought about walking down right then. I thought about it seriously enough that I actually took 2 steps toward the elevator bank before I stopped myself, because I knew, the way you know things in your body before your mind catches up, that if I crossed that lobby floor and said her name, her real name, the one only 3 people alive still remembered, she would bolt. People who build identities out of dead children's social security numbers don't do it because their lives are going well. They do it because somewhere behind them is something they are still, 17 years later, running from. If I spooked her, I might lose her again, and I didn't know if I would survive losing her twice. So, I did the harder thing. I went back to my office, closed the door, and sat in the dark without turning on the lights, because I didn't trust my own face not to give something away to whoever walked past my window, and I needed the dark to think. My mind went back, the way it always did on nights like this, to Ohio, to the parking lot outside the Meijer on Reynolds Road, October, cold enough that Elena's breath fogged in front of her, while she complained about her shoes being too tight. I remembered holding her hand, crossing that lot, remembered the way she skipped every 3rd step, because she'd decided that was a rule she'd invented that week, remembered buckling her into the booster seat and telling her we'd get pizza on the way home, because I'd had a good week at the dealership where I was working 60-hour weeks trying to claw my way up from selling used sedans to managing the lot. I remembered dropping her at her mother's apartment that Sunday night, the custody handoff that had become routine after the divorce, and I remembered I would remember this until the day I died. The sound of her mother's voice through the closed door, already sharp, with an argument that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with a man named Dean Whitfield, who had started showing up at pickup times, standing in doorways with his arms crossed like he already owned the place. 6 days later, Renata packed 2 suitcases, took Elena out of Reynolds Road Elementary in the middle of a Tuesday, and vanished. No note. No forwarding address. The custody paperwork I'd filed within 48 hours meant nothing once they crossed state lines. And by the time the private investigator I hired with money, I didn't have traced them to a motel outside Louisville. They'd already moved again, this time paying cash and using a name that wasn't theirs. I spent the next 3 years pouring every dollar I earned into investigators, into lawyers, into a nonprofit that specialized in parental abduction cases, and I got exactly nowhere, because Renata Alvarez Whitfield, she'd apparently married Dean somewhere along the way, though the marriage certificate itself was as hard to pin down as everything else about them, had grown up with a father who ran a small-time document forgery operation out of a print shop in Cincinnati, and she knew things about disappearing that most people never have to learn. By the time I sold my first tech patent at 29 and had real money for the first time in my life, the trail had gone cold enough that even the best investigators I could hire told me gently that some trails just end. I didn't accept that. I built Kestrel Dynamics into what it became, largely because building something that big gave me the resources to keep 3 separate search efforts running quietly in the background for over a decade, long after any reasonable person would have stopped, long after even I had started to suspect I was chasing a ghost that had grown up into someone I wouldn't recognize, even if she stood in front of me. Except apparently, I would recognize her. Apparently, 17 years and a fake name and a janitor's uniform couldn't erase whatever it is in a father's eyes that locks onto his own child across a crowded lobby like a compass needle finding north. I sat in that dark office until nearly 11, running through half a dozen versions of how tomorrow could go, discarding each one because they all involved me saying something too fast, too much, too soon. I thought about writing her a letter and having Dolores Ferreira deliver it, but that felt like something out of a soap opera. The kind of gesture that would terrify rather than reassure a girl who'd spent her whole life being taught that letters from strangers meant danger. I thought about simply requesting her personnel file be transferred, so she reported directly to building management instead of the contractor, giving myself a legitimate reason to be near her. But that felt manipulative in a way that made my stomach turn, even considering it. Because if she really was hiding, an unexplained transfer to closer proximity with the man whose name was on the building might read as exactly the kind of threat she'd spent her life running from. In the end, I decided on something smaller, something almost pathetically small, given the size of the company I ran and the resources at my disposal. I decided I would simply be there, not confront her, not corner her. Just be present, visible, ordinary, the kind of presence a person can get used to slowly instead of all at once. I would start eating dinner in the building later than I usually did. I would take the stairs instead of the elevator on nights when